Cave was not a bad place to be. It was cool. This particular cave had lots of water around it, even waterfalls, and they were in the midst of the desert, and there were plants all in this area of a little oasis. It was a great place to be because David and his men hide in there. They even had a great view because they were elevated a bit and they could look down and see the Dead Sea. But the problem with a cave, when you're a refugee hiding from an evil king, is in a cave you could be trapped. And there's no chance of escape. As a result, David and his men had to be very quiet. It got harder because David was moving closer to the source of danger. And the closer he got, the harder it was to be quiet. They were on the run from the evil king, King Saul. And yet, David and his men had seen God's blessing in so many ways. They were in the dark of the cave. Outside, they could see the brilliance of the sun. And those kind of at the entry to the cave were silhouetted. And in the way of the cave, although his features might have been hard to make out, it was clear that the one solitary figure between them and the sun was King Saul. One for whom David had been loyal, even though Saul in no way returned his loyalty. David was an outlaw. David was a traitor, at least in the eyes of the king. And the king wanted him dead very badly. And so here he is, vulnerable, alone. I mean, David's in that position, surrounded by his men, but cornered. But even more so is the king, vulnerable and alone. The last while had been pretty wild for David. He'd gone from royalty, from living in the palace, the son-in-law of the king, to being a fugitive, fleeing from justice. And now, all of a sudden, between where we left the story last week and where we pick up the story this week, he's commanding a small army. He's got a couple of hundred men, and they're basically living almost like a small independent nation on the southern borders of Israel. He'd even gotten mixed up in foreign relations and issues. The nearby town of Keilah had been attacked by the Philistines, and a representative of the town had come to David, not even gone to Saul, come to David and asked for help. And so, over the objections and the fears of his men, David consulted God and gotten permission to go and rescue the people of Keilah. It was probably not a full army that was attacking the town, but armed herdsmen who were looking for land to put their livestock on. David had defeated them and taken all of their livestock for his own. And then he stuck around town for a little while. It was a little town. He got to know everybody very quickly. And he looked, one gentleman in particular who was well known, and David one day noticed he doesn't seem to be around anymore. So he asks everybody, what happened to so-and-so? Everybody got quiet. And David kind of looked and sensed something was wrong. And he pushed a little bit more. Well, what's happening? He'd gone off to Saul to report where David was. So David went to the priest and consult God. And should we be worried? Is this town that I had just saved, are they going to sell me out? And the answer came back, yes. Yes, they will. So they took off. And very quickly, Saul is in pursuit. They get to a mountain, and David is dug in on one side up the hill a little bit, and Saul's coming around the other side, and we're almost ready for a big battle. Saul's got the bigger force. David's a little bit better entrenched. When God intervenes. And the message comes to Saul, now the full army of the Philistines is invading. You've got to come quick. And God preserved David in this moment. Last week, if you're with us, if you weren't, you can find the sermon online. Last week we saw a series of stories in which David is threatened in much the same way, but he goes into an absolute panic. And he reacts poorly, and he puts people's lives in danger. He acts immorally. He acts in a way that he should not. He lied. He consorted with the enemy. He messed up. And here in this story, just next chapter, he's calm. He's collected. He's ready. I think he's learned something. All of us in life are going to find ourselves at times where David found himself. Between this town that he rescued, between Saul, between the armies of Israel, they're chasing him. He's being wronged. And for all of us, at times in life, we will be wronged. At times in life, we will be offended. And at times in life, I'm going to do things that offend other people, and they're going to overreact. And at times when that happens, my first reaction may not be the best course of action, and probably not the most godly way of acting. When someone else's actions cause me to act a certain way, really I'm in bondage. I'm letting them control myself. David confesses in several psalms that were written from this time about his sin and about his need for God. He's seeking wholeness from God. When dealing with the town of Keilah, he had just confessed his need of forgiveness. He sought God, and therefore he was ready for when people acted in their sinful ways, when they acted in fear, when they acted in outrage. The next couple of stories we're going to look at between David and Saul, and in this story of Keilah, we're seeing people who are treating David in a sinful way. In a way that might be very natural for them. And when they act in that way, it does not change David's ethics. It does not change his behavior. It does not change his outlook. It does not change his reality. Instead, he has compassion that others are just as frail, just as insecure as I am, that they are going to do dumb things just like I do dumb things, that they're going to say the wrong things just like I say the wrong things. By learning more of the glory of God, he is better able to deal with people. Which brings us back to this cave. It's called Gedi. You can go there still today. It's overlooking the Dead Sea. You can look out from there, from waterfalls to see across the Dead Sea to what's down Jordan, which in David's day would have been Moab. It's a pretty place. Beautiful place in the desert. And Saul is done with the Philistines, and now he brings an army of 3,000 men to deal with David once and for all. Except he gets there and everybody's in hiding in caves. And he's not entirely sure where David is. Now Saul at this stage, he's getting to be an older man, he's aging, but he's still healthy. He's doing things to look after himself. Now, as we read this story, it seems clear that he's eating healthy because he's eating a lot of fiber anyways. It's going to be where this story's going. Because all of a sudden, as he's walking along, he has the call of nature upon him. And he needs a little privacy. And he looks up and he sees a cave and says to everybody, "You hang on here for a minute. I need a few minutes of privacy." And he heads up to the cave to do his business. And David and his men are astounded as they hide in the dark as Saul walks in and turns. They can see his backside. David hears whispers from his men. "This is God's day. Isn't there a prophecy? I will give your enemies into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." Oh, it sounds kind of biblical-ish, except it isn't. It is easy to make earthly wisdom sound biblical. David leaves his men behind. He creeps up to Saul with his sword in his hand. And his men are astounded that David doesn't strike out. Instead, he cuts off part of his robe. He does not kill him. He still makes a subtle jab at Saul. In fact, more than subtle, it's a powerful statement. According to the law in the book of Numbers, Saul would be unable to wear this robe if it's cut like this. And it's the robe of the king. He cannot wear the king's robe. That's David's little statement that he's making. He spared Saul's life, but he makes a political statement. And immediately, David is hit with grief of what he was done. This wasn't godly. This was not the way that God wanted me to act. So he sneaks back to his men and explains, again very quietly, that it would be wrong for him to lay his hands against God's anointed, the king. Yes, he's a problem. Yes, he wants to kill me. But that should not change my actions. Saul's done. He gets up, leaves the cave, apparently leaves them a little gift behind, gets out a little ways, and David creeps to the front of the cave. And the way I envision this is the sun is up quite high in the sky at this moment behind the cave, and Saul's coming down, and David stands with the sun behind him, and Saul's eyes are still adjusting to the light. And David calls out to Saul. And Saul turns around, and his eyes take a moment to figure out who's calling him. But David calls out very clearly and very distinctly, "Why are you listening to people who say that I am bad? I could have killed you. Look, I have a corner of your robe. That's all I did. I want you to understand that there is no threat that comes from me. You've come at me with an army, but I'm just a dead dog or a flea in the desert. Strikes Saul in a powerful way. As he calls out, David, as I do. The quick summary is he agrees. You're right, I'm foolish. And he says something quite remarkable, actually. Surely God will make you to be the next king. David, can you do me a favor? Don't act like all the other usurpers out there in the world. Do not harm my family when you become king. And David has already made this exact same promise to his friend, the crown prince Jonathan. So it's easy for him to make that promise once again. He's already done it, and so he promises again. David is polite. David is respectful, even while he's honest about Saul's evil. This place and Gedi, these caves by a waterfall, had become his refuge. And yet God was first and foremost his actual refuge. In Psalm 2, it says, "Blessed are all who take refuge in him." In Psalm 5, it says, "Let all who take refuge in you rejoice." Psalm 7 says, "O Lord my God, you do I take refuge." Psalm 11, "In the Lord take refuge." In fact, 37 times in the Psalms that either David wrote or people who are writing in kind of David's tradition, right, talks about God becoming the refuge, the place where refugees, the place where people who are desperate can go. In desperate times, he had found refuge, and it was symbolically in this place of Gedi, but even more so, it was in his Savior. David had found a place to run, and that was critical. Refuge is where you can go when the world is out of control, when the world has become chaotic. And David has discovered it's not just this place where I can go that's safe. It is the person that I go to. It is God himself. In the moments of disaster, I go to God. Psalm 57 is a psalm that is written in the midst of this same time when these stories are being told. And it reads like this: "Be merciful to me, O God. Be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge till the storm of destruction passes by." I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purposes for me. He'll send from heaven and save me. He'll put to shame him who tramples on me. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. My soul is in the midst of the lions. I lie down amid fiery beasts, the children of men, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. How do you respond to that? That's how David responds. "Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. They set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. They dug a pit for me, but they followed into it themselves. My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody. Awake, my glory. Awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations. Your steadfast love is great to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. How could David allow Saul to escape? As I read this psalm, it's just full of divine confidence in the midst of struggle. David is too secure to allow emotions to control his behavior. He focuses on glory, not on despair. He has an honest understanding of life and the eternal, and thus he reacts in an eternal way. When somebody mistreats me or slights me in some way, my reaction is usually not to lash out. If it's me, I tend to stew on it for a few days. If somebody angrily disagrees with me, I play it over and over and over again in my head. At times, maybe I complain to anyone who will listen. What about you? But it can be hard when we perceive a mistreatment. What makes David different? How much of it is because as he's hiding in a cave, he calls out, "Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth." The last couple of chapters, he messes up. He keeps sinning. And God has compassion on him. How much does understanding the compassion of God allow him to show compassion to those who wrong him? How much does that change him? No, doesn't act as he did in the previous chapters where there's all sorts of emotional responses. Instead, he has one goal, and that is to obey God. And it is hard to obey God when we're attacked. But his focus is in the right place. We're going to skip a chapter, chapter 25. We're going to come back to it next week. It's a very interesting chapter. It's very relevant. And it's very interesting because in the midst of these chapters in which I'm saying David's doing what's right, we're going to skip a chapter and come back to it next week in which he messes up. Chapter 25. So we'll hang on for that. But a little bit of time passes and we get to chapter 26. Saul is appeased for a period of time until some people called the Ziphites, people who live in the desert of Ziph, in the southern part of the tribe of Judah, people who should have been relatives, allies, helpers of David, go up to the capital Gibeah. They go to Saul and they get him all riled up again. They get him riled up to the point that Saul again chases after David. Saul gets up. He grabs all the available men. He gets an army together and they go on a march. And David's army is getting a little bit more powerful. They're not running as much. They actually camp near each other, almost like they're getting ready to go to war. David grabs a couple of people. Grabs somebody by the name of Ahimelech the Hittite. Now, it's interesting because last week I've been naming all these sermons, what I'm trying to point out, such as this week is compassion, and then David and a person. This is the one week I'm saying David and a place in Gedi. But last week we talked about a guy by the name of Ahimelech, David and Ahimelech. This is a different one. It's a Hittite, which is a whole interesting thing. He's not even Israeli. But he gets him and his nephew Abishai, and they sneak up to Saul's camp to do a little spying. And they kind of blend in there. This guy, not everybody recognizes them, and people are mostly asleep. It's night, and so they get to the edge of the camp, and it seems safe, so they keep sneaking. And as they get more into camp, everybody's sound asleep, so they keep sneaking in and keep sneaking until finally they run across two gentlemen, Saul and Abner. Abner's this big general, bodyguard, who looks after him. They come up to these two, and they're sound asleep. And Abishai looks at him and says to David, you know what? I'm going to grab his spear that's sitting there, and I'm going to do this. It'll be so quick, Saul won't even know what hit him. He'll be over, and he won't suffer. And David immediately, all we're going to do, we're going to take his spear, we're going to take his water jug, and we're going to go over there. You guys keep following me. They sneak out. They get out of camp successfully. And they get a little bit of distance between them and the camp. And they call out. They call out specifically, David calls out to Abner. Abner, I thought you were looking after the king. How is it I was able to steal his spear and his water jug? Saul overhears it. He kind of wakes up. He's a little bit tired and trying to get himself going. David, my son, is that you calling? Now it's interesting, in both these stories that I've just told, where David calls out to Saul, David replies, David, my son. Whenever David, in other places, he calls David to everybody else, that son of Jesse. And it's a way to show that he's kind of this lower class, whatever. But here, David, my son. And David calls out, let God judge me. Don't risk yourself by judging me. We're going to go through the whole bit that he talks about, but Saul repents and invites him to return to the palace. Now, David does not, but he does return his stuff. You know, the Bible has a lot to say about vengeance, a lot to say about judging, a lot to say about things like gossip, slander, how I deal with things when I feel that I'm being mistreated. Most of us focus on the wrong things. David is more interested in dialing the controversy back. Most of us would rather get our point across. But David just wants to calm things down. You have to be careful so often when things get out of hand, when things feel like we're attacked. I end up talking to lots of people. Recently even got a call from somebody who doesn't attend our church saying, I'm upset with my church because they're reading this author and I don't like this author. Can you help? I don't know what their point was. It was to gossip about it, but I said, have you talked to the author of the book? And he said, well, how would I talk to the author? Well, the Bible tells us if we have a problem with a brother or sister, we're to confront them and take it and live with us. We're never to phone and gossip. He said, well, that's really hard. When does the Bible say, well, it's okay, you obey until it's hard? And if it gets hard, stop obeying. The Bible never says that, does it? We're to obey. We're never to ignore the scriptures. David's story is about being obedient when it is least natural. That is the call of God on our lives, to be obedient when it's hardest. And that is when people are acting their worst. This morning I've done 3 chapters really fast. I've skipped a lot of details. But I want us to just understand that this is not just about treating people right when they mistreat me. That is absolutely part of it. But I see a commitment here. Jesus in the Gospels is asked, so what really matters in faith? What's most important? And he says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, mind. In fact, Jesus calls this the greatest commandment. He says there's a second one that is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Elsewhere, he fleshes it out. He talks about loving our enemies, praying for those who persecute you. It's all about compassion when it is really hard. There is only one way to love your neighbor as yourself, and that is, first of all, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to keep him as primary. This is all about keeping us focused on what really matters. Focused on a God who is all powerful. It's hard and complicated to love people. It is so easy to focus on what offends, what angers, what we seethe about. But they're not my focus. I am called on to love God. Hebrews 4:16. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace. That's the call on us. Focus there. Come to God, receive grace, receive compassion, receive hope, receive love. And then he finishes that verse by saying this: to help in the time of needs. In other words, we can help in times of needs when we've gone to God and we've discovered love and hope and grace. We need Jesus. That is the only way to live in the supernatural way in which David does. I'm going to invite our worship team to come forward, and we're going to sing, Lord, I Need You.